It's DBA700 Foundations Research Writing. It's week 5, and no, that's not me wearing shades. That's a younger version of Tom Cruise. However, we do have some things that might require some close scrutiny, so let's take a look. First of all, let's look at the readings. We're going to be covering a couple of new topics in academic writing that are extremely important this week. They're related, but we'll look at them as being independent, but I'll kind of summarize why they're important to work together. And those are transitions and academic voice. Okay, so I'll be going to those during this presentation, but I want you to do the readings because they explain in more detail and provide more examples and give you different perspectives, but we're talking about the same thing. And again, it's an extremely important skill that will help you throughout your entire doctoral program. Whichever direction you're going, you will need to use transitions, and you will need to be able to understand how to use others and writer's voice when you're writing your papers. Okay, so these are excellent. They're not very long, and they provide a good background for the next phase of writing. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these independently. First of all, transitions. Transitions are the sentences or phrases or words that make logical connection between ideas. Now, many times writers, student writers especially, assume that since the teacher, the professor, is reading their paper, the professor already knows all the stuff that they might be writing, and so consequently they feel like it's unnecessary to explain things. Okay, but as you know, the audience for academic writing may sometimes be a very general audience that doesn't know how the ideas connect together, doesn't know what you mean by a particular term. And so consequently, as you're writing down different ideas, especially when you're looking at different literature, different ideas from different authors, a lot of times they get thrown into a paper, just one idea, and then bounce to another idea, then bounce to another idea, without any kind of flow or logic or what we call transition between the various sections of the paper. Now, this can occur at several different levels, but let's look at an example first of just how we connect two different ideas together that might, in a paper, end up in separate paragraphs. Okay, so here we have an example. Overall, Management Systems International has logged increased sales in every sector, leading to a significant rise in third quarter profits. Okay, that's the end of one paragraph. Now the next paragraph starts. Another important thing to note is that the corporation has expanded its international influence. Okay, so here we have two separate ideas. One is an increase in profits, and another is the increase in international influence. Could they make this transition smoother to connect these two ideas together? So a revision, which would include a transition, might be: overall, Management Systems International has logged increased sales in every sector, leading to a significant rise in profits. That's exactly the same as the first sentence. But now they're going to transition by using these impressive profits relating back to the previous sentence are largely due to the corporation's expanded international influence. Okay? So the writer on the revised version here has connected these two ideas by reusing the word profits to connect the second idea with the expanded international influence with the profits. So to the reader, this now makes sense that these two paragraphs, these two sentences belong together because they're separate ideas, but now there's a connection between them. Okay, and that's the idea of transition. Here's another example. Fearing the loss of Danish lands, Christian IV signed the Treaty of Lubeck, effectively ending the Danish phase of the 30 Years' War. Now we go on to the next paragraph, but then something else significant happened. The Swedish intervention began. Okay, again, two separate ideas being presented separately. Could they be linked through a transition? So the revision is, again, the first sentence is exactly the same. Fearing for the loss of more Danish lands, Christian IV signed the Treaty of Lubeck, effectively ending the Danish phase of the 30 Years' War. But then starting the next paragraph, shortly after Danish forces withdrew, the Swedish intervention began. So here, the writer has rephrased by taking the last phrase of the first paragraph and using the word Danish in the second paragraph. So now you know a connection between the two. So they're using the term shortly after, meaning now you have a timing connection transition, but it leads directly on to what the point of the second sentence is, which is the Swedish intervention. But now the two paragraphs belong together because of the transition. Now you think, well, this is so simple, just adding a word here or a word there. And it seems like, well, why wouldn't everybody do it? But if you're not paying attention to it and you're not thinking about it, it generally doesn't happen. People tend to write the way they think, one idea here, one idea here, one idea here, without saying, well, the reader doesn't know the connecting logic that I have in my mind. It has to go down on the paper. So a lot of times you'll read the feedback that I put on your papers and I'll say, where's the transition? You have one idea here, you have a totally different idea here, there's no connection. You put them side by side or one after the other, but you didn't make any connections for the reader to follow what the flow is. And again, it's a more sophisticated level of writing which we're aiming at. So here the transition was based on the word Danish that connected the two sentences together. Now there are different types of transitions. As the papers start to get longer and you add multiple sections to your papers and subsections, you're going to need to tie those sections together. Just because you've finished talking about one article and you start to talk about the next article or the ideas from the next article, you have to make a transition. In your mind, there's got to be a connection why you put those two sections together, how they follow each other. There should be a flow of logic that connects these things together, and to explain that flow of logic, you've got to write transitions. Sometimes it's a sentence or two, okay? Sometimes it's simply a word that connects them together. So if you have two sections of your paper that you've put together, but there's no logical connection between them and there's no transition between them, then those two sections of your paper probably don't belong together. Probably you don't have a good logical structure to build your paper around. So we have transitions between sections, both major sections and minor sections. We have transitions between paragraphs. This will generally occur at the beginning of the paragraph, where you tie the paragraphs together with the first sentence of the next paragraph, or at the end of the paragraph, where you use the last sentence of the paragraph to tie to the next paragraph. Or you may have a transition at the beginning of the paragraph and at the end of the paragraph. It sometimes is a word, a single word, for example, however, or for example, which leads directly into the next paragraph. Or sometimes you need a phrase, a sentence, or several sentences to explain the relationship between these two paragraphs. And there's even transitions within paragraphs. Now these are usually just a single word or a short phrase, but it allows the reader to know what's coming next before they even read it. You've kind of built the anticipation. Well, now I know kind of where we're going with this, so I shouldn't be struggling to figure out the flow as I'm reading your prose, as I'm reading the different ideas you're presenting. You shouldn't put the burden on the reader to follow the logic that you're trying to present. That's up to the writer. Now here are some examples, and I realize they're kind of small, but these do come out of one of the articles. But it's an example of different types of transitional expressions. So if the expression is a logical relationship of similarity, two things are similar, then the transition would be the word also, or in the same way, or just as, likewise, or similarly. So you, the writer, are letting the reader know that you consider these two things to be similar. But without that expression, then you've got to think, well, the reader's got to figure this out. The reader's got to figure out that I really mean these two things are similar to each other. And the opposite of that would be where you're trying to show that they're different from each other. You're trying to emphasize a contrast. And here you would say, but something, or however, or in spite of, or on the other hand, notwithstanding. So here are a bunch of words that sort of indicate you as the writer are trying to tell the reader that this is a different idea. This is in contrast to the idea you just presented. There are also transitional words to show sequence, where you say first of all, second of all, third of all, and finally. So you indicate the order of ideas. Then there's time transitions, as we saw in the previous example, where it showed that this was coming after something else. Okay. Then there's applications where you use a for example or for instance. There's emphasis, where you say indeed or in fact or of course. There's place and position, there's cause and effect, there's additional support or evidence, there's conclusion or summary. Okay, so these are just one sample of types of transitional words that can be used to tie different ideas together, either tying different paragraphs together or tying different sentences together. But again, you'll see increasingly in my feedback on your papers where we're now getting a little more sophisticated. Now we've got to start drilling down on the details of the writing and the writing style. And again, practicing this and using this consistently in your writing, you'll just start, it'll come naturally, and you'll realize you've got two ideas, you need to make a transition between them so the reader knows why you put these two ideas together. Now, the second major topic that we're dealing with in this week is what's called voice. Now, there's two different ways voice is used, and I don't want to get you confused. So in this particular slide, I'm going to be talking about when you're using the author voice and the other voice, or sometimes called the writer voice and the other voice. And what does that mean? Well, the other voice is the information that you're taking from other sources, other literature, other articles that you're using, and you're supplying that other's voice through use of quoting, where you're quoting exactly what the other article said about something, or you're summarizing it, but you're basically using the other person's ideas, or you're paraphrasing it. But anyway, the information is coming from other work. Okay, that's the other's voice. And when you put that in your paper, you know, you're going to put a reference by it because it's going to indicate that, yeah, this is somebody else that said this. I'm putting it in here. You know, it's part of my paper now, but I've got to indicate that I'm using somebody else's ideas. So that's the other's voice. And then there's the author voice. That's your voice as the writer. That's the narrative that presents the argument that you're trying to use. That the other's voice is really the evidence that you're providing. The argument is what you're trying to say. You know, and do you need both of these? Yes, you need both. In scholarly academic writing work, it needs to be based upon evidence, but you've got to tell the reader how you want to use that evidence. So let's take an example. Here's a paragraph taken out of an article, again, on motivation. This one says, any attempt at such a comprehensive integrative theory of motivation needs a strong unifying foundation. Evolutionary theory has played a dominant unifying role in the biological sciences and may now be poised to play a similar role in the social sciences. Therefore, we grounded the present theory of motivation in contemporary evolutionary concepts. Evolutionary theory may serve this unifying role well for motivation because it has a great explanatory power, particularly when it addresses brain and social development. Okay, I'll tell you right now, there's both a combination of other's voice and author's voice in this. Well, we can see that one of the places that we must have author's voice is where we have the citation. We know DeWall in 2002 contributed something to this paragraph. So let's take a look at it. Well, if we look at the first sentence, it says, any attempt at such a comprehensive integrative theory of motivation needs a strong unifying principle. Now, that seems to me to be the author starting to build their argument. Okay, so this is the topic sentence for this paragraph. So they're saying, you know, we realize that the way we're going with our thesis is we're looking for an integrative theory. Now, why would we think that's possible? And why would we think evolutionary theory might be the direction to go? Well, because DeWall in 2002 wrote that evolutionary theory has played a dominant unifying role in the biological sciences and may now be poised to play a similar role in social sciences. Okay, there's our evidence that says we're going in this direction, and here's somebody else that thinks that this is the way to go, that this might be an approach. But did they finish with Wall? No. Now they want to say how they're going to use it. So now the finishing couple of sentences are back to the author's voice, where they say, therefore we, and they say we because there would be a number of researchers involved in this, we grounded the present theory of motivation in contemporary evolutionary concepts. Evolutionary theory may serve this unifying role well for motivation because it has great explanatory power, particularly when it addresses brain and social development. Okay, is this what DeWall said? No. This is what the author of this particular article is saying. Why didn't they just put a citation for DeWall at the very end of this paragraph? Well, because the part that DeWall contributed was only the one sentence. The rest of it is the author's argument about why they're going to be presenting this particular evolutionary theory of human motivation. Okay? So many times students take a whole paragraph and then they stick a citation at the end of the paragraph, and we're supposed to figure out, well, is this everything that just came from another source, or are there pieces of this that are yours and pieces of it that came from the other source? So I hate to see paragraphs end up with a citation because it doesn't tell me what the author, what the writer of the paper is actually saying. It indicates that there's nothing in that paragraph that is any of your ideas. Okay, so you can see how you have to balance the writer's voice and others' voices. Okay, so that's one description of voice. Okay, so and this relates to transitions because you can see this final sentence or two sets the stage for the next part of the argument. So it'll serve as the transition to the next part of this paper. Now there's another interpretation of academic voice, and this is active versus passive, or sometimes direct versus indirect. And this actually affects the complexity and the style of your sentences. It's a more detailed level. Okay, so these two definitions of voice are totally different things. This is determined by the placement of the subject of the sentence relative to where the verb is. So let's look at an example. If you write the sentence, the entrance exam was failed by over 1/3 of the applicants to the school, you basically put the subject, which is 1/3 of the applicants, after the verb. And this is a form of indirect voice or passive voice. And it ends up making for a more complicated sentence than is necessary. To convert the same idea into a active voice or a direct voice, you would write it, over 1/3 of the applicants to the school failed the entrance exam. So here you put the subject in front of the verb. 1/3 of the applicants is coming in front of the verb, and now it's acting on the entrance exam. Okay, so as they say here, this is an example of the active voice because the sentence subject performs the action. All right, so that's the definition. Those are the examples. Let's look at one more here. You could write in a indirect or passive voice. You would say the action on the bill is being considered by the committee. Here the subject of the sentence is the committee, but because at the end of the sentence it confuses kind of the sentence. Whereas if you simply switched it around and said the committee is considering action on the bill, now you have an active form sentence, which is simpler and easier to understand. Now the difficulty with writing passive form sentences is many times because they're kind of convoluted, you end up making them much longer than they need to be by adding additional phrases to kind of make it sound right and get all the information in there, where you could simply simplify the whole sentence, get the subject in front of the sentence so that we can see a more direct relationship between the subject, the verb, and the object, and simplify your writing quite a bit. There's a tendency in academic writing, because we want to make it look more scientific and more objective, people slide into writing a lot of passive voice sentences. And yes, it's appropriate for certain circumstances, but on the other hand, the best writing incorporates both styles. Active voice is perfectly appropriate in many cases. Passive voice is appropriate in other instances, depending on what you're trying to say. So really, you need to be able to use both types. But many times, if you send your papers into the writing studio, they'll come back and they say you're overusing the passive voice. You have to use more active voice sentence structure, and that will clarify a lot of what you're trying to say. So let's look at the assignments. First of all, in the discussion, we're going to be doing another critique of an anonymous student paper. This one is called The Two-Factor Theory of Frederick Hertzberg. It's in the Week 5 folder in Start Here, so you'll just be able to get it out of there. And you'll want to make another copy of the checklist. And this week we're going to be using the entire checklist because it includes many of the techniques that we've studied over the past couple weeks. It includes transitions and voice, etc. Okay, so that's going to be our discussion. It's going to be the same. You're going to post your critique in the discussion post, and then we'll talk about what you see in the paper versus what others see in the paper. The Week 5 paper starts to incorporate a lot of the literature that you've got now. So first task is you're going to go out and find 5 more peer-reviewed journal articles on human motivation, and I want these to be studies. Studies are different than theoretical articles. The studies will actually present a hypothesis or a proposal There'll be a way of going and collecting data, and then there'll be a statistical analysis, and then there's a presentation of the findings and interpretation of the findings relative to the purpose of the study. They will still have a thesis statement, they will still have an introduction, they will still have a conclusion, but in the middle of the paper there will be actual hard data being analyzed. Okay, and it's good for you to start realizing, you know, that's the form of a dissertation. That's the way a dissertation is going to look, so you need to kind of understand how these things are put together. So you're going to use 5 more articles, and that's going to make a total of 17. You'll have 2 from the first week, 5 from the second week, 5 from week 4 where you went out and got the abstracts, and now you get 5 more articles for this week. And based upon now 17 articles, you're going to keep working on your paper. It's going to now expand from the 3 pages it was before to a 6 to 8 page paper that's going to use the 17 articles that you've read. Now you may find some of the articles don't fit what you were trying to do. Then you need to drop that one out, don't use it, and find something else. Using more evidence is always a good idea, but it's got to be relevant to the type of paper that you're writing. It's got to be relevant to your thesis statement. Okay? And I want you to apply the techniques that we've learned over the past 5 weeks of planning, thesis statements, structure, argument, evidence, transitions, voice, and conclusions to incorporate those in your paper. Now I realize this is going to be a draft, and we're going to continue to work on it over the next few weeks to make it better and better, but this is going to kind of be the structure. If you haven't decided on your thesis statement at this point, you know, or pretty close to what it's going to be, you better think long and hard about that before you write this paper, because this is going to be the bulk of what you're going to turn in week 8. Okay, so you don't have to submit the peer review checklist, although I think it would be useful if you, when you evaluate your paper before you turn it into me or turn it into the writing studio, to use that checklist compared to your paper and see how you're doing relative to that. You will be using the checklist in future weeks as we start to evaluate each other's papers. Now, one of the things people always talk about in a doctoral program, even in the very beginning, is dissertation. And it's kind of pointless at this point. However, you can't stop people from wondering about it and what to do about it. But I find a couple of cartoons kind of useful to incorporate about the dissertation process. And here we've got a couple sitting in a coffee shop. I guess back in those days this would be a Starbucks. But and she says, "I'm writing my dissertation on latte sizes." Well, I would have to see a little bit more about how that was going to progress. And here we have another one. Student is going to his chairperson and presents his proposal to write a dissertation on Baywatch. And because it's the Department of Marine Biology, I guess the professor, the advisor, says it's a good deal. Okay, well, probably neither of these are going to be appropriate for our programs here, but it's something to think about if you go to residency this year. I'll be talking more about dissertations and the process there. I always tell students, you know, if you're in your beginning first year of the program, you're far away from trying to think about a topic. You don't even know the theories that you could possibly use. So, you know, put that off in the back of your mind. You can, you know, read about it, discuss about it, watch the videos I present about it, but you shouldn't really be too anxious about, so what's my topic going to be, even though some people will say, well, I already have my topic. I doubt that they do. They may have something, but it's probably not going to be their topic. So the keys to success. Look at the different theories within human motivation. Hertzberg has a different theory than Maslow. Allberger has a different theory than Maslow, and we see there are different theories, but we're looking for similarities and differences to be able to compare and contrast. And because they're talking about human motivation, you know, there's got to be an underlying DNA that links them together, and that's what you're really looking for when you analyze these papers. You shouldn't be writing your literature review one article at a time and saying this article said this and this article said this. You should really be picking out what are the components that are similar or different between these theories, and then use the articles to analyze those particular elements, okay, to establish a strong link between those elements or a strong counter-argument to those elements. So I would like to see the papers not revolve around individual articles and say, well, this article has a heading, this article said this, and another heading, this article, and then you say this article said this. You know, what relates those articles together? That's what's going to be important. And there are going to be divergent views, so you should be starting to look and evaluate the validity of the approaches. Do they have enough evidence to present that particular viewpoint? Now I realize this week is going to be tough, not only because you've got to do a critique of a paper for the discussion, but you've got a longer paper and more readings to do. But this is one of the easiest classes you'll take, so we kind of stay at it consistently, but we had kind of a down week last week, and now this is a push forward to the next plateau. So yes, you may lose some sleep over this, but you'll make up for it in the subsequent weeks. And then you're not going to want to avoid what you've done before. The paper that you wrote for week 3 and the articles that you've analyzed already should help you present the paper for this week. So there's got to be a continuity in the literature. Well, that's about it for this week. If you have any questions, you know how to get in touch with me. I'd like to celebrate the fact that we're passing the halfway point of the class and moving on into bigger and better things. So I'll leave you with a little bit of joyful dancing. Bye and good luck.